Welcome everyone to another Infernalist build guide. This is a guide for a very cheap Spark Archmage build. Basically, it can literally be put together for 10 Exalted Orbs on the Trade League. Super accessible on the Solo Self-Found League, which is exactly why I've been playing around with it with my level 92 Infernalist. Requires no uniques. You can speed clear tier 15 maps, kill tier 4 bosses on T15 maps. It can easily fit in rarity gear, which is quite meta at the moment, so can serve as a very intermediatory, I guess, build for getting your farming started for more expensive builds. So very much a stepping stone kind of build. I will stress straight away, or preface the video, obviously this isn't any sort of meta build by any stretch. Spark Archmage is much more suited to the Stormweaver in general, but however, you know, this video could be intended for any Infernalists out there who have already got a relatively high level Infernalist around the 60-70 mark in their mapping. Don't enjoy minions, struggling to find the required gear to really make demon form work, and just want something to, you know, help them out to get to T15 maps, start to get a bit of a farming setup going. And yeah, so let's just let's dig in. As I said, Stormweaver's probably much more suited to this, an Archmage setup. However, the Infernalist passive tree does offer some interesting options with some interesting tech, which I guess will be probably the main highlight of this video, to really point those out and see how they fit in with everything. So let's dive straight in. As I mentioned very firstly, this is an Archmage Spark setup, which centers around 3 key passive nodes, that being Mind Over Matter, Eldritch Battery, and Chaos Inoculation. The reason for this is there are some pretty nice synergies with some of the Infernalist passive nodes, which we'll dive right into. Firstly, Grinning Immolation. Positive here being the 30% more critical damage bonus. However, the downside being the self-ignite, causing 15% of your life energy shield as fire damage per second. With Eldritch Battery and with Chaos Inoculation, as you can see, we have 1 life total. What this means is, if you do the math, 15% of 1 is basically nothing. So really, the combination of Eldritch Battery with Chaos Inoculation completely removes the negative downside of this passive node. Secondly, Altered Flesh. Key line being the physical damage taken as chaos damage. Once again, since we're running Chaos Inoculation, this means that this node gives us 20% physical damage reduction for free. Obviously, Chaos Inoculation gives you chaos damage immunity, so that 20% conversion of the physical damage means you basically take 20% less physical damage. The other node we pick up quickly while we're looking at the Ascendancy tree here is the Infernal Hound. The Infernal Hound is quite problematic in that it dies quite quickly without any investment into the minion passive nodes. However, with some of the support gems and with how quickly you're flying through the maps, it does offer a little bit of extra damage reduction, another 20%, so still a very handy node to pick up. As I stressed at the beginning, it's a very simple build to set up, and you really only need your first 2 Ascendancies and basically picking up the Grinning Immolation and the Altered Flesh. The Hellhound's a bonus for the third Ascendancy, and the fourth you literally don't need at all. I've put my 2 points from the fourth Ascendancy just into getting more mana and more spell damage, because everything else really doesn't work with this build. So, in terms of your passive tree, as I highlighted, really the core passives, I'll actually jump into the Maxroll planner, which I'll attach to the video, make it a bit easier to break down the passive tree. So in terms of the core setup, you're effectively pathing straight to these 3 key nodes. The other clusters that you're picking up basically centers around getting more mana. With Mind Over Matter, your health pool is effectively your mana pool, so this build is very much focused around getting as much maximum mana as possible. So Mana Blessing, raw mana up here. We'll get into gear, but everything on your gear should be very much mana orientated. Eldritch Battery converts all your energy shield to mana, so you'll be getting energy shield armor pieces. And then we're also investing focus into quite a bit of mana regeneration. Damage taken recouped as mana. I'm toying around with whether this is actually worth picking up, but I'm testing it out at the moment. Bit of a mana regen cluster here. Bit more mana regen there. All of this is very much mana regen orientated. Also picking up all the high value intelligence nodes. More intelligence is more mana. And then in terms of your damage orientated nodes, basically picking up all the elemental damage here, as well as more elemental damage on crit. There is quite a heavy focus around crit in this build as well. And then the 2 key crit clusters being Controlled Magic here, which also has a defensive upside, being the reduced crit chance against you, as well as this one here, which also has 25% less critical damage taken, as well as all the crit bonuses along with them. We then pick up, I have the weapon swap setups here, but if you want to just focus on not worrying about curses on a weapon slot, just focus on the weapon set 1 nodes here in the red. Crit nodes here as I mentioned, and then the key lightning damage nodes here. So that pretty much covers it in terms of the core setup for the passive tree. We're also picking up quite a few close dual slots along the way. These are, I have some recommendations here, but anything centered around mana regeneration, spell damage, anything crit chance or crit damage orientated will all be helpful in those nodes. In terms of the weapons set swap for curses, I don't want to go into too many details. There are other YouTube videos out there which may be worth looking into. But what is very commonly run in these kind of builds is you run a second weapon set, and for that weapon set you basically choose these 2 curse orientated classes here, as well as these 2, which give you much more magnified effect of your curses, as well as duration, and very highly recommend. That's all shown here in the Maxroll planner. Some later options, very highly recommend picking up these crit orientated nodes down here if you're looking for more damage. Running more skill effect duration and projectile speed on Spark is also very common and sought after. For those of you that are not aware, skill effect duration, when it applies to Spark, means that the sparks last longer, so they travel further. Likewise, if they're going quicker, they travel further. So it basically just means each spark is more likely to hit the target
Likewise on bosses, spark rebounds off terrain, so much more likely each spark hits the boss. Some other options are this cast speed node over here. For those who aren't aware, currently, whether it's a bug or not, I'm not sure. It feels like a bug, but case inoculation with the max life becoming 1 means your counters both being on full life and low life at the same time. So this low life benefit of the cast speed does work. If you're feeling very adventurous, you can path all the way down here, although I don't necessarily recommend the investment in the traveling nodes, but Pain Attunement for even more crit damage bonus on low life. And that pretty much covers it. So another option with this build, for the Infernalist specifically, since we don't have just Arcane Surge for free. Arcane Surge is a buff that gives you more cast speed and, more importantly, mana regeneration, which is why Stormweaver is typically very good for these sorts of builds. But since we're quite heavily invested into crit, I run with 32%, for instance, on my spark, so relatively high. But what you can do as well on this build is invest in this node over here, which is the 10% chance to gain Arcane Surge on critical hit, as well as these two here, which is another 10, giving you 20% chance to gain Arcane Surge on critical hit. Then you just get the nodes that increase the Arcane Surge effect as well. Considering how fast you're casting Spark, I believe there's 2 or 3 casts almost per second. If you really max it out, this 20% chance on crit almost gives you close to 100% uptime on Arcane Surge. So that's also an option. So that's all outlined in the Maxroll guide here. Next, abilities. I won't spend too much time on this. Honestly, any Arc, Mage, Spark setup that you'll see out there for Stormweavers or any other Ascendancies, you can pretty much just plug and play here. Likewise, you can pretty much use any spell combination you want. All you'd change out is pretty much this cluster of lightning nodes up here for any other element combination that you want. Eye of Winter potentially with its benefits for critical weakness. If you've got a lot of spirit on your gear and want to do a cast on, crit, or honestly any combination, feel free. But I'll quickly go over what I'm running personally. I'll just go top down. The Infernal Hound, as I mentioned, the key thing here that you want to be doing is maxing out how long it can survive. So some good supports for that are Last Gasp, survives for 4 seconds extra after it goes to 0. More resistances, more max life, and then plus level to the skill, which also buffs its max life. And it's also counted as a fire spell, so you can have the 2 masteries there. Spark, quite important on the Infernalist without its without its easy access to Arcane Surge and copious amounts of mana regen to use Inspiration to cut down the mana cost. The next 3, honestly, as I said, there's plenty of options here. I personally run Arcane Tempo for more cast speed, Elemental Focus for more raw damage, as I don't rely on Spark for my shock application, and Considered Casting. Other good options are Pierce, projectile speed, skill duration. There's plenty of options here. Archmage, more mana regen if you've got the spirit for it. Keep in mind that has an extra 10 spirit reservation, and plus the lightning skills. Orb of Storms I use as my kind of debuff applying utility spell for stronger rares and especially on bosses. So lightning exposure with its strip away to increase its effect. I use it for shock application as well. And Font of Anna is, I'd say, probably the most important support gem here. So especially on boss fights to really get that extra 40% mana regen while you stand within the Orb of Storms. Flame Wall, just pretty much solely used on bosses just to get a little bit extra DPS out of each spark. Basically any projectile that passes through it gets some added fire damage. So Spell Cascade, Fortress, and Persistence, basically just increasing its area effect and make it last longer. I personally run Arcane Armor because I have the Spirit for it. I find it's very handy for when you get swamped by some melee mobs to basically either push them away or kill them quite quickly. Basically it provides a bit of an aura around you, and if you get hit by melee, damages them. Support Gems Budgeon, just knock back enemies, and extra freeze. As I mentioned, conductivity I run on a weapon swap, so you can see here, I've got it on my second weapon set. Increase effect, reduce delay, more area of effect. Ice Overhead, ignore. I don't really use that much these days. It's still there though. That's pretty much it in terms of abilities. We've covered the passive tree gear. So this is really the real advantage of this build being its very low gear requirements in terms of just getting initially set up. It does have some room to, well, quite a lot of room to grow as well in terms of much like any mana stacking build. There are a number of very expensive uniques that you can get to really boost your mana to, I think I've seen people around the 9,000, 10,000 mark. I'm currently sitting at around 4,000. I'd say at a minimum you really want to get to about 3,000 at least. As much as you get quite a bit of damage reduction from our Ascendancy tree with Altered Flesh and the Hellhound, there are some big one-hit abilities out there, and anything below 3,000, especially if you don't have the mana regen to also support Archmage, it does get a bit hairy. So that's very much the downside of this build. If you're struggling to get enough mana, you can be quite susceptible to getting one shot. That said, I'm on SSF. I literally slapped this build together with just random pieces I had lying around in my stash after running Demon Form for a long time. Basically got sick of hunting all the pieces required to really make the uncapped Demon Form shine, so can change to this, as I found it a lot easier to farm T15 maps as well. It has some rarity pieces as well, which I'll show in a moment, so just finding this much more effective at the moment. That said, I did jump on the PoE2 trade site to have a look at the trade league to see how much some of these pieces would go for. If you exclude the rarity rolls, pretty much the primary stats you're looking for are at least one or two resistances on each piece to cap out your resistances, maximum mana, and buffs to energy shield. So a piece like this, excluding the rarity roll, and every slot you can effectively get for one exalted. So you can put this whole build together for 10 exalted. So as I mentioned, the priority is getting your mana up. Main roles you want to be looking for on your armor pieces are resistances, solving that problem, maximum mana, mana regen on rings, amulets if you can get it, since we are quite starved on the Infernalist. On your chest piece, I'm running a high energy shield, or the highest energy shield chest piece I could find within my stash with some resistances here. However, you probably want to ideally be going for a expert Kef raiment for the implicit mana regen on top of that. Jumping from each piece to, we'll go over each piece actually just quickly to go, I guess, more details for those that are interested and those that want to see my gear specifically. Your wand, key stat that you're looking for here is plus level of lightning skills or whichever element you're after. Secondary to that, anything spell damage, max mana, crit chance, mana per enemy killed can be handy. Intelligence, which is more mana. But the key thing here you're really looking for is the level of all skills. Your focus, likewise, key thing you're looking for here is the plus level of all skills. Other than that, mana, energy shield, like I said at the beginning, Eldritch Battery converts your energy shield to mana, so the higher you can get your energy shield on each piece, the more mana you have as well. Crit chance is handy. I believe you can get mana regen on these as well as resistances. Helmet, or every single armor piece for that matter, excluding boots, which we'll get to in a moment, but basically energy shield again, max mana, intelligence, resistances. Highly recommend fitting in rarity, obviously, very meta at the moment and very imbalanced, so if you can get rarity, definitely go for it. Again, rings, mana, cast speed can be handy, although be careful with cast speed. If you stack too much cast speed, especially on the Infernalist, if you don't have enough mana regen, it can really strain the mana usage and mana regen against Archmage. Cover the chest piece. Belt, pretty much resistances. This is a really horrible piece here. I was just trying to get I believe I just needed cold res. As you can see here, I'm still lacking a little bit. Gloves, also just pretty much just a triple resistance roll here for me. Absolutely horrible prefixes. Boots, another stat you really want to be looking for, I'd say at a minimum, is 20% increased movement speed. And as the rest you can see here, not the greatest pieces overall. Amulet, maximum mana, very handy. Spirit, very handy. Amulet actually will cover also in what's good to enchant onto the amulet using your emotions, which for those that don't know, from Delirium, these things, if you right click on one of these, brings up a menu where you can instill a single passive node onto your amulet. What I personally have gone for, the very cheap option, is Electrifying Nature here, which just required envy, greed and paranoia, which are very common emotions. So this is a very cheap option for all those on a budget, or all the solo self-found enjoyers. However, there are much more high value options which are more expensive. I believe there's mental toughness here. The reduced mana cost would be massive for us as an Infernalist, as well as mana regen. This is probably the main one you'd want to go for. I believe there's another one here, conservative casting, also very good, very similar. Mana regen with reduced mana costs. If you really want to play on the defensive side and work off of Altered Flesh with the 20% cold and lightning converted to fire, you can stack fire resistance and get, I believe there's a node somewhere here, Unnatural Resilience, which is maximum fire resistance for each 40% uncapped fire res that you have. You can really push your fire resistance up to 80 plus, with the maximum, I believe, being 90. So this is a very good defensive option, but very expensive, I believe. Isolation ×3. So that pretty much covers it in terms of gear. One thing I'll highlight in terms of gears for those that are interested, I've outlined some of the priority stats here in the guide, as well as secondary stats, and listed them all on the items here. But there's also these rich people options in terms of scaling the build to much higher mana levels. Dream fragments, being a key piece with the increased maximum mana, further corrupted, I believe this gets to 24. You can run Morio Invictus, and don't pay too much attention to the two rolls here in terms of the max mana and spirit. I believe there's various things that can roll here: intelligence, per socketed rune, soul core, max mana, but basically you can get a corrupted version of these with 5 sockets and really boost your mana as well through this. Ingenuity, doubling up the effect of your dream fragment on a good roll or close to it. And this shield, which similarly to the chest, you can, I believe, get 2 or 3 sockets on this and 700% close to effect of each one. So you put in your max mana or your 2% mana, I believe, soul cores into here and get a big boost to your maximum mana through that as well. That pretty much covers it. There was a little bit of a showcase at the start. I'll play the video again for the last maybe minute or so. I was killing a difficulty 4 boss in there as well and managing to do so with this build. Downsides of the build I touched upon. If you're struggling to get the mana to high enough levels, you can be quite susceptible to one-shots. The other thing to be very careful of is the mana siphoning rare mobs. For those that aren't aware, the best way to handle them is be aware that when there's a mob, I don't have an image of one here, but effectively the ring that you see around them, you'll notice there's 2 rings. And the mana siphoning zone is effectively within the barriers of those 2 rings. So you can actually get right into the face of the mob to avoid the mana siphon, or you can try and stay on the outside of the ring. That pretty much covers it. Hopefully there were some interesting things for people here. Like I said, I want to stress this isn't a meta endgame build by any stretch. If you really want to take Archmage and Spark to the highest levels, Stormweaver is the better ascendancy for it. But however, if you're stuck with an Infernalist at a reasonable level and want to try something different, or want a stepping stone build to farm up the currency or the gear to progress to a different demon form, minion, or other sort of build, then this is really fantastic. Super simple and cheap to set up. So I'll leave you with that. All the best, guys. Happy hunting. And cheers.